welcome to Journeys and Journals. I was just reading this book about traces, and I dressed the part today, and we're going to trace that trail, the pioneer trail that brought this lady and so many others out west. My guest is Fred A Dayton.
To you, Bernie, that's okay.
Fred Dayton II. From, where do you come from, Fred?
Grants Pass, actually. I was born in Everett, but grew up in Grants Pass.
Why were you born in Everett?
Well, my folks were in that area during World War II and came back to Grants Pass when my father enlisted in the Navy because of the war.
And he wanted Mom to be where the family was?
That's correct.
In case he didn't come back, maybe?
Well, he knew she could be comfortable there, and that's when they bought the house on 6th Street, the big old Victorian that you remember.
Oh, yeah. And let's talk about that a little bit, because that house stood for how many years?
Well, the house was built in 04, 05, and it was moved in 77, and it still stands on Conklin.
Oh, and the house next door to it?
The Flanagan home, the brick home that was a restaurant and then a real estate office, they were built at the same time. The Mrs. Flanagan and Mrs. Dixon were a little bit competitive, and if one had an upstairs front porch, the other had to have an upstairs front porch. And the original photos, there was a captain's walk on the Dixon house, they were built simultaneously.
Well, now, the Flanagan house, we know the Dr. Flanagan was first doctor in this part?
He was actually the second doctor to come, the railroad brought him to Grants Pass.
And the railroad came?
In 85.
Great. Well, you've just got so much history, and I know one of the reasons is that your mom and dad both loved history.
Well, as you are aware, my father was the president of the Josephine County Historical Society for a couple of years. They were instrumental in the Schmidt House coming into the ownership of the society. And yes, the history of the county and the area has always intrigued me. The old mines, the photos of the old logging operations, understanding what people did. Dixon, who built the house I grew up in, was at dry goods. That's where he made the resources to build a home like that.
Very nice home. And was that called Orchard Avenue, or was that?
Wow, you really are testing me. It was always 6th Street when I knew it. It was, of course, a piece of Highway 99. If it had ever had a name before that, they never shared it with me.
99 went from Mexican border, Canadian border,
That's
and
correct.
anybody that was going north-south came by your house.
That's correct.
Well, you just almost wonder how did a kid that grew up on Main Street with cars whizzing by get so interested in pioneer travel? And I'm going to just ask you to tell me, what's the story?
You grow up in a house that's built at the turn of the century, and it's a neat old Victorian, and you get intrigued by the people who built it, whose energy went into it. And on the front porch of that house was a rocking chair. And it was in dilapidated condition, but Mother would never let go of it. It had cane bottom and back, and she couldn't find anybody who could redo the caning. Well, finally, a man was at the house because of the plumbing shop, and he says, "Irvily, if you won't give me that chair, will you at least let me restore it for you?" So that's how the restoration of the chair came about. But that chair came west on the Oregon Trail. Louisa Dixon was a Crockett, and the Crockett family was one of the families coming out, and that chair was part of the belongings that they brought with them.
Because there probably weren't very many chairs brought out west. This is a real treasure.
Well, it was bulky. I've looked at that thing. When I was a kid, I didn't think much about it. But today, I look at the volume of that chair, and they may have disassembled it to put it in a wagon because of the pure volume that it takes up.
Well, Fred, how do you know so much about this pioneer trail called the Oregon Trail that goes clear to Oregon City?
Well, I was intrigued by it in a variety of ways, and the book that you're holding right now called Traces was published by a very small, unique publishing company based in Enterprise in northeastern Oregon. It's called the Bear Wallow Press. And that book, the first half of it, is interviews with people who came to Oregon in covered wagons. Now, you figure those interviews took place in the late 70s. These people were 80 years old and 90 years old, and their recollections make up the first half of the book, and it's fascinating. The second half, then, is a novel based on these interviews. It's made into a narrative of people coming west.
And, could be a movie, huh?
Could be a movie. It, if you read that, you will find a lot in there that you have seen in movies. But later on, I was doing appraisal work, various parts of the state, and at the time of the sesquicentennial, the 150-year celebration of the Oregon Trail, we had a major appraisal job in Baker City, actually in Sumter. And they new interpretive center for the Oregon Trail had just been completed. So we had an opportunity to be there during the early opening period. They had narratives presented by people dressed like you. One of the things we learned that I think you will find interesting is much of what we know about the Oregon Trail were the diaries that the women kept. Because many more of the women were literate than the men.
How's that, Fred?
Because they were able to go to school. From the very young age, the boys worked the farm. And the mothers gave more credence to book learning, as they would say, than the fathers did. And as a result, the diaries that you find in these archives, many, many of them are the stories done by the women, and you get the women's perspective.
Okay, and the stories that you know and tell come from your mom?
So not so much from my mother. The stories, the fascination that I have of the trail is really from our exploration. My wife Bertie and I have, after the appraisal was done in Baker City, we started searching out pieces of it and searching out books related to the Oregon Trail. So I can't tell you that we started in Independence, Missouri and drove the whole thing. We have been on most all of it, but in segments. And of course, the last segment occurred in May this year when we came back from Texas, and we spent a lot of time in Wyoming along the Platte River, Fort Laramie, Independence Rock, all of these names that are associated with the trail. Fascinating thing about that is the Platte River was running a flood stage. And if we had been approaching that river in a wagon and we had to ford it, we couldn't have done it. We'd have had to wait for the river to drop. Now, the cattle were beautiful because the grass was lush from all of this rain. I mean, the coat on the cattle just shined. They were so healthy. But that river would have been an insurmountable challenge, and you had to get across it. So we were at locations where people had operated ferries later in the history of the trail. In the first few years, from 1843 forward, they had to ford it. But later on, people came in and they built ferries, and they charged you to bring your wagon and your livestock across. But that was much safer than trying to ford it.
Safer, yes. There's still a ferry on the Willamette River that I have gotten much fun over, just going across and coming back.
I understand what you're saying. Do you know up toward Portland, Jedediah Boone Ferry Road? Have you ever seen the sign, the reference to it? Well, Jedediah Boone was a descendant of Daniel Boone. And when he was no longer able to operate the ferry, and I think he was about 90 when he gave it up, the state built a bridge at that location. But my parents made a special side trip when I was a kid so that we could cross the river on Jedediah Boone's ferry. So, you know, what kindles your interest? All of these things. Would you take your children out and you say, this is what was done 100 years ago, and they go, oh, well, that's interesting. You never know what seed you're planting, because maybe it's 5 years later when they go, that really was interesting.
I was there.
Right. And when I can tell you that I crossed the river on Jedediah Boone's ferry, means more to me today than it ever did when we made that trip.
Well, it was up near Albany that I figured I had to try that one, because I've been on other ferries, but learning about the ferries on the Rogue River, learning about the ferries, well, just about any river, you needed it, especially if you were going far.
Oh, absolutely. Fording the Rogue River, there were very few months out of the year that you could safely do that.
And fords, that's Medford. There.
Fording, the
That's
ford.
Same word.
Same word. I think there's a place back east that Medford got its name from. But all of these things contribute to our fascination with our history.
Well,
and the Oregon Trail has a lot to do with who we are and our perception of life in Oregon. The people that crossed this trail, that left Missouri and what they knew, came across all of these areas and all of these difficulties, brought with them ideals. They brought with them beliefs. And those came forward into us becoming the people we are today. You know, the Oregon Trail is the longest graveyard in the world. It averages a grave every 80 yards.
Oh.
25,000 people, and that's the best estimate thing put together, died on the Oregon Trail. Many of them from disease, an amazing number from accidental gunshot. That just blew my mind. But a lot of the people who started on the trail were unfamiliar with firearms. We assume in that time period everybody knew about firearms, but they didn't. They came from the east where they didn't know them. But you look at these areas and you read about the people and the beliefs that carried them across this land.
Well, I can imagine fire was a problem. You're cold, you're wet, and you want to get a little closer to the fire. You're a child. But then, of course, there was disease. An awful lot of disease.
There was a thing called prairie fever. And we don't know today what it really was. But it set in like pneumonia. And when particularly a child developed it, they had about 24 hours. And there was no medicines known at that time that could help. But you talk about fire, one of the things that is interesting, much of this is plains. There's no timber, there's no trees, with which to build a fire. What there was dried buffalo chips. And one of the great things in when we were in Baker City at the Interpretive Center, and this woman was doing a soliloquy, and she says, and you would look at this and go, and what does food taste like when it's cooked over dried buffalo chips? Yes, it tastes like dried buffalo chips. So
because we know hickory, if you cook over hickory, it smells like,
that's right.
tastes like.
So, you know, when we think of hardships and various aspects of it, and people learning how to live in a manner that they weren't used to, living on the move. You know, on your farm, you got your home, you got your stove. On the move, you have only what you can have with you.
Speaking of that, and that's where these come into play. They didn't bring along many toys and dolls and things.
There wasn't room for them.
But you probably had a scrap of fabric, and so Mom said, oh, we'll tie it with a bit of twine, and this will be the mama doll, and this is the baby doll. There they go. And they could just play happily.
Absolutely. We look at this and we go, wow, can you imagine a kid today playing with this? But the availability of toys and the expectation of entertainment was dramatically different, even at home, much more so on the trail. But, you know, communication was by foot. So many of these things that we take for granted didn't exist. One of the things that's fascinating on the trail is we look at this, and this is a nice dark line across the map, and wow, that looks fairly easy to follow. But let's say you're the third train to start out that year. Well, you can't follow exactly the way the previous trains went because their livestock ate all the grass. So now you have to widen out, and you can get to the north or you can get to the south. But that's why it was so important to have a scout and a guide to keep your wagon train on the general course.
Westward ho.
Westward ho. Where can I keep my oxen, my mules, and my horses fed so they have the energy to keep my wagon moving? Likewise, finding water. Finding water for your stock, but not too much water so you couldn't afford it.
So that's why they go along one side of the river.
That's right.
In places looking for.
Yeah, and you watch, when you see these, one side of the river will be a sheer cliff right into the water. The other side you have some bank. So here you can travel. And then you go 20 miles and you run into a situation where it's just the opposite. So you have to cross the river to have land on which to move your wagon.
Otherwise, you'd be going uphill and downhill if you could get through the forest.
If you could get up the hill, yes.
But you mentioned no trees. I remember one book, and it's probably Little House on the Prairie or something like that, that they took straw and wound it really tight. And you could make it burn a little longer that way.
That's right.
I mean, how they had to put their thinking caps on for all this stuff.
Today we refer to it as survival. To them, it was life, just the way it was.
Just the way it was. Now, what's the reason for the sunbonnet?
Mostly to protect your hair and your face from the sun. There were different sunbonnets, I'm sure, but I think it was mostly the protection.
Well, and these were made usually out of scraps of material that weren't good for much else, just the same way that aprons were made from maybe the front of Dad's shirt because the back had given out, you know, how from sun and all. Aprons were necessary. Why?
To protect your clothing from the hot sparks, from whatever, because preserving the clothing, you may only have 2 dresses. And so you're going to do everything you can to protect it. But the other thing that flour sacks, when the flour sack was empty, it was converted into a garment. Lots of your children's clothing were made from those flour sacks.
Now, where did you learn this?
There's reference like in that book, the other things we read.
I see in this very picture that some of these wagons no longer had canvas on their tops.
That's right.
I understand that these canvases sometimes were made into clothes.
If it was necessary, if the weather damaged, the canvas played a very important role in protecting your goods from the weather and protecting you. But everything about the wagon was used. It was your mode of transport, and when you got to where you wanted to go, then you used the wagon. If you weren't going to transport goods anymore, you converted it into the roof for your house.
Uh-huh.
You ever wonder how they built a roof on a soddy?
No.
They took the wagon, they built the walls with sod. They took all of the lumber out of the wagon, used it to structure the roof, and then put sod over the top of it.
I'm so glad you came to Better Life Television. Where's home for you nowadays?
Roseburg.
Okay, so you've come a ways to share your stories, but nothing like the trail you've gone just learning about this. Show me where all you've been.
Well, actually, we have been over most all of the trail in various pieces. We've been to St. Joseph, Missouri, and started out, it's interesting, and this doesn't show it, but a ways out of St. Joseph, or Kansas City, Missouri, the Santa Fe Trail breaks off. And then the Oregon Trail continues more to the north. And we have tried to follow the Platte River, the various places where I think you can identify the marks.
You really can.
Oh, yes. You've got to get to Baker City. You go into that interpretive center and you look out to the southwest, the ruts are visible. Those impressions in this soil from those heavy wagons are still visible.
How many wagons do you figure went on this Oregon Trail, came west?
I have never read speculation on that. It would have to have been thousands. And we know it started in 1843. We know the railroad was in place in the late 1860s, 1870. So we're inclined to think, well, the Oregon Trail wasn't needed. Very few people could afford to transport their goods on the train. So the Oregon Trail continued into the 1890s. I had a marvelous visit years ago with a man whose family moved to Boise, Idaho in a covered wagon in 1920.
Well, after cars, after trucks, after everything happened.
Yes, except they couldn't afford a truck or a car.
And they did have a wagon.
They did have a wagon, they had a team, and the farm they were living on, and he told me, I can't tell you, but it was like a week's move in the wagon to get to Boise. But that's where the employment opportunity was, and that was the means available to move the family.
Wow. Tough times. And they never complained? Or, diaries don't seem to be very, what I've seen.
No, I think they had a more positive attitude and a different level of expectation. That's a real tough thing to describe, but life was harder from our perspective but perhaps it was more satisfying.
Oh, to get those clothes white. Yeah.
You know, what you accomplish with your hands can often be much more satisfying. You know, there's very few log houses anymore around that were built by the people who were going to occupy it. I only know of one in this county, and it was built in the late 1960s by a couple of reformed hippies who went out and found the poles and built the house. But the way of life was hard. A lot of people left this area because they were very dissatisfied with the Civil War. They didn't want to take a side.
We'd call them draft dodgers now?
We could. Or we can understand that we know that brothers fought brothers and this sort of thing, but there was a lot of dissatisfaction with what had occurred and what was occurring. And so they had because we had a huge unsettled nation, they had a place to go.
Boy, we're running out of time.
Is that right?
Thanks for traveling the Oregon Trail with me. I'm just so fascinated. 1846. Folks, some of us got here, some of us flew here. Thank you very much for tuning in to Journeys and Journals. I'm Bernie Martin Beck.